Snow fell like torn lace across the wide street of Coldwater, each flake hushing the world, even as voices pressed close around the rough-hewn platform, where souls were traded for coin. The air smelled of damp wool, horse sweat, and the faint iron tang of expectation. Boots stamped to keep warm, shawls were tugged tighter, but no one left. The promise of spectacle was stronger than the cold. At the center of it all stood a girl barely grown into womanhood, though sorrow had carved her into something older. Her name, whispered once in kindness, was Chenoa. Today, no one spoke it. They called her widow and burden, as if the weight of those words might drive her lower than the snow that gathered on her shoulders. Her shawl was thin, more threadbare curtain than protection. Stray hair, brown and trembling with frost, clung to her pale face. She kept her eyes low, though each hiss and mutter cut through her lowered lashes. Pretty, but useless now. Can't even keep a husband. Best sold cheap for work. The crowd laughed, the sound brittle as ice snapping on branches. Chenoa's hands clutched the shawl at her throat, not for warmth but to hold herself from shaking apart. She had dreamed once of love, of a home that might soften her loneliness, but now she was paraded like livestock, her worth weighed in coin and cruelty. Elias Boone, the auctioneer, loomed above her, red-faced and greedy-eyed, stamping his boots and clapping his hands as though conjuring heat. His voice boomed, practiced and sharp. One strong widow, fit for housework, sewing, whatever a man might need. Young, too, barely 20. Who'll start me at $10? His grin stretched like leather, waiting for bids that did not come. Instead, the townsfolk shuffled, smirked, let their eyes crawl over her like flies on fruit gone soft. The sheriff, Alden Graves, leaned against a post with his rifle and his scowl, his presence less about law than about judgment. His gaze slid toward the edge of the crowd where a tall figure stood, unmoving as stone. He was hard to miss. Shirtless despite the snow, his skin bronzed and scarred, a fur cloak resting heavy on broad shoulders. His hair was black as raven wings, tied loose so the wind caught it. His eyes, dark and unblinking, watched with a weight that silenced even the rowdiest laughter. Dakota, they called him, the Apache giant who walked alone between two worlds. Mothers hissed for their children to look away, though they stared anyway, drawn to the gravity of his stillness. He had not come to town for weeks, but now he stood there, as if summoned by the cruelty of this day. At his side, slower and older, sat a man with hair white as frost and eyes that carried the ache of years. Elder Keona, Dakota's father, his face lined by weather and war, seemed carved from the same patience as the snow itself. $5 then. Boone barked, sweat shining even in the cold. 5? Come now, gentlemen. She'll keep a cabin clean, she's strong enough to bear. The laughter that followed was not kind. Chenoa's breath shuddered. Shame burned hotter than the chill. She thought of her husband, buried 6 months now, his death swallowed by whiskey. She thought of the nights spent on strangers' porches, begging for bread with eyes lowered. She thought she might faint there in the snow and vanish before the hammer fell. Still, no hands lifted. Not until one voice, low as thunder rolling from distant mountains, broke the air. $1. The crowd stirred, shock cutting the cold sharper than wind. Boone froze, his mouth half open, then barked a laugh. $1? You mock me, savage. His words tried to sting, but the silence around Dakota was heavier than insult. He did not flinch, did not raise his voice. His arm lifted, steady as an oak branch. $1, he said again, eyes fixed on the girl who dared not look back. Gasps and whispers spread like wildfire. Martha Calloway, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued, sneered from beneath her bonnet. A widow for a savage. Lord forgive us. Men muttered about stolen women, about laws ignored, while Sheriff Graves shifted, hand near his rifle. Boone cleared his throat, tried to recover his bluster. $1, you say? Do I hear $2? $2 for a young widow. The crowd answered only with snickers and the crunch of boots on snow. No man wished to follow Dakota's claim. No one wished to own what he had touched. Boone's grin faltered, and at last his gavel struck wood. Sold, he spat, to the Apache, for $1. The sound echoed through the square, louder than the bell that tolled the hour. Chenoa swayed, her breath hitching. Relief did not come. Fear did not leave. Instead, a strange trembling filled her, some mingling of terror and dignity she could not name. Dakota stepped forward through the parting crowd, each footfall measured, snow crunching like drums in the silence. He reached into the fur cloak and set a single silver dollar upon the platform, gleaming against rough wood. His hand was scarred, large enough to eclipse hers entirely. For a moment, she thought he might touch her, claim her with the same roughness that had haunted her past. Instead, he simply waited, his gaze never leaving her bowed face. "Will you work?" Elias Boone taunted, desperate to regain the crowd's mirth. "Or we're white beside him forever?" The words rang out, cruel jest for the watching town. The laughter that followed cut her skin raw. Chenoa's throat ached, but no sound came. Dakota did not answer. His silence was weightier than any vow. He offered no promise, no command, only presence. And somehow that was worse, or perhaps better. She could not tell. The sheriff's stare bore into her, daring her to resist, to cry, to collapse. Instead, she lifted her head. Just enough for the snow to catch her lashes, for her eyes to meet the dark, unreadable ones that had claimed her fate. The world slowed. The laughter dimmed. She saw no mockery there, no lust, no pity. Only a stillness that steadied her own quaking heart. In that heartbeat, the auction ceased to be a stage of shame. It became the beginning of something else, uncertain, dangerous, but alive. She shivered, not from cold but from the weight of it, from the shift that made her feel less like property, and more like a soul glimpsed through frost. Boone clapped his hands, urging the crowd to disperse, to seek warmth in taverns and gossip. But whispers lingered, suspicion brewed, and eyes followed as Dakota turned, waiting for her to step down. Chenoa's knees trembled, her shawl heavy with snow, yet she moved. One step, then another. Down from the block, away from the jeers, toward the man whose silence held more promise than any bargain spoken that day. The street stretched wide and white before them, the storm thickening, the horizon blurred. Somewhere, Martha hissed her disdain. Somewhere, the sheriff spat into the snow. But Chenoa's gaze stayed forward. She did not yet know if she was walking into safety or fire, into freedom or another cage. All she knew was that she had been bought for $1, and the hand that reached to steady her did not grasp, only waited, palm open, as if asking her to choose whether she would take it. And in the hush of snowfall, the choice hovered, trembling, as the town held its breath. Snow whispered against the world as Chenoa walked beside the towering figure, who had purchased her life for a single coin. The crowd's jeers still rang faintly in her ears, echoes that clung like smoke long after the fire had died. Her shawl sagged heavy with frost, her boots soaked through, but she did not stumble. She feared if she faltered, his hand would seize her wrist in ownership. Yet Dakota's hand never touched her. He strode ahead, silent, each step deliberate, his shadow long across the pale drift. The older man, his father, followed slowly on a small horse, white hair gleaming like the snowfall itself, his lined face neither stern nor kind but patient, as though the world's cruelty no longer surprised him. The path from town to cabin stretched endless. Each crunch of snow beneath their boots carried the rhythm of judgment, a reminder that she was no longer free to choose where she walked. Still, something in Dakota's silence unsettled her more than harsh words might have. She had known men who filled every room with orders, with fists and drink, with scorn thick as smoke. This man's restraint was foreign, heavy, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She almost wished he would speak, even to curse her, if only to shatter the weight of it. By the time they reached the small cabin nestled at the tree line, dusk was settling, the horizon a blur of silver and violet. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and the scent of pine needles mingled with the sharper tang of burning wood. Dakota pushed the door open without flourish. Inside, warmth pressed against her chilled skin, startling tears into her eyes. The cabin was plain, rough-hewn logs, a single table scarred by use, a small fire glowing in the hearth, and furs laid neatly across one corner where bedding must be. The simplicity was startling. There were no shackles, no crude trophies, no signs of possession. Only a space meant for living, not display. Takoda set aside his cloak, and the firelight danced across the scars carved into his chest, silent testimony to battles survived. He moved with the steadiness of a man who knew his strength needed no boasting. Chenoa clutched her shawl closer, shrinking near the doorway. She half expected him to gesture, to claim, to command. Instead, he crossed to the table, broke a loaf of coarse bread, and set it down. Then he sat, wordless, as though her presence required no acknowledgement beyond simple provision. Elder Kiona entered behind them, his steps unhurried. He placed a hand on her shoulder briefly, not to guide, but to steady. His touch was light, more question than demand, and his eyes, deep with years, studied her with a sorrow she could not decipher. "The storm will grow," he murmured, his voice cracked yet steady. "Better to sit near the fire." Then he moved to his place by the hearth, lowering himself with a weary sigh. Chenoa lingered. Pride warred with hunger, fear with exhaustion. She had eaten nothing since dawn, but a crust begged from a tavern door. Her belly tightened with ache, yet she could not bring herself to reach for the bread. To eat was to accept. To accept was to yield. Her husband's memory rose unbidden. His sneer when she asked for food, his hand striking when she dared eat first. The shame of that ghost clung bitter on her tongue. Takoda did not press her. He tore his half of the bread, chewed slowly, and without looking at her, slid the rest toward her side of the table. His hand withdrew as though he had left an offering at an altar. No command followed. No words at all. The loaf sat between them, steaming faintly, until hunger's cruelty forced her fingers to twitch forward. She ate in silence, eyes lowered, each bite burning with humiliation, yet softening the hollow of her stomach. He did not watch her. He chewed as if the bread were no different than any other night. She could not decide if that stung more or less. Night gathered quickly, the storm deepening outside. Wind rattled the shutters, and snow hissed against the roof. The fire crackled, its glow soft on the fur-draped floor. Takoda laid fresh wood on the flames, sparks leaping. Still he spoke no word. Chenoa's breath slowed, the warmth lulling, though unease coiled tight in her chest. Was silence a mask for cruelty to come? Or was it his truest self? She searched his face when he turned toward the fire, and in the brief flicker of light, she saw not hunger nor mockery but weariness, the kind that carved deeper than years. She chose a corner of the cabin, curling into her shawl, every muscle taut with waiting. Takoda spread a second fur across the floor a respectful distance away, laying himself down without ceremony. His father closed his eyes near the hearth, his breathing steady, like the tide of a river. Chenoa remained awake longest, watching, listening. Her mind replayed the jeers of the townsfolk, Martha Calloway's hiss, the sheriff's stare like a noose tightening. She had been sold for $1. She had been claimed by a man she did not know. Yet here in this cabin of silence, no hand had struck her. No voice had cut her down. The absence itself was strange enough to tremble through her veins. When at last she drifted into shallow sleep, dreams came harsh and vivid. She dreamed of standing again on the auction block, her shawl gone, laughter biting like hail. But when she lifted her head, the crowd had vanished, and only one figure remained in the storm. Takoda, unmoving, snow gathering on his shoulders, eyes fixed on hers. She woke with a start, heart pounding, uncertain whether fear or something else had woken her. Dawn seeped pale through the shutters, painting the cabin in shades of gray. Takoda was already awake, mending a broken tool with patient hands. His father sipped a tin cup of something steaming. Neither spoke. Chenoa sat up, clutching her shawl. She waited for command, for direction, for anything that would tell her what this day would demand. None came. Only Takoda's quiet focus, the scrape of his knife against wood, the soft whistle of the kettle. She felt adrift, unseen yet strangely unbound. Outside, the storm had thickened. Tracks leading to town were already buried beneath the night's fall. She realized, with a sharp twist in her chest, that returning was impossible now. The town had washed its hands of her. Gossip would be thick as smoke, judgment etched into every doorway. She belonged nowhere. The truth was as bitter as it was freeing. Her only shelter lay here, in this cabin where silence reigned, with men who did not demand her name or her labor, yet offered her bread and warmth as if those were enough. As the fire hissed and the wind howled beyond the logs, she understood with sudden clarity that the question Elias Boone had mocked at the auction, "Work or wear white?" was no longer jest. It hovered now, silent and real, suspended between the walls of this cabin. She did not know what choice she would make, nor what choice Dakota intended for her. All she knew was that silence could not hold forever, and when it broke, it would shape her life as surely as the snow that buried the road behind them. The storm did not ease in the days that followed. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, muffling the world in white silence. Chenoa kept to her corner, moving with quiet hands, folding the furs she borrowed for warmth, tidying the few utensils after meals. Dakota's silence weighed upon her still, but there was a strange steadiness to it, like the deep hum of the earth beneath frozen ground. His father, Elder Keona, sometimes spoke, a handful of words, a story broken by long pauses, as though each syllable had to be carried carefully from the well of memory. Through his voice, she began to hear echoes of a world older than the town's jeers, a world that saw dignity not in coin but in survival. One night, while the fire flickered low, Keona told her of the first snowfall of every year. How it came to cover both hunter and prey alike, erasing tracks, making all equal under its blanket. "Snow does not ask what you have done," he murmured, his breath curling like smoke. "It asks only if you will endure." Chenoa clutched those words in her chest. For the first time, endurance felt less like punishment, and more like proof that she still belonged to the living. Yet the peace was fragile. Sleep brought dreams she could not outrun, memories of her husband's bitter laugh, of debts shouted over whiskey, of blows struck for imagined slights. She had thought death would free her from his cruelty, but it had only left her branded. Her parents, ashamed of the disgrace, had turned her away. The town saw her as spoilt goods. She remembered knocking at doors with a tin plate, begging for crumbs with her shawl pulled low, hearing the snickers as latches closed in her face. Each recollection clung to her like soot, staining even the small grace she now found in silence. Dakota seemed carved of a different stone. He rose before dawn, splitting wood with powerful swings, carrying logs as if weight meant nothing. He moved with certainty, the quiet rhythm of a man who needed no audience. Chenoa watched him from the window sometimes, the snow glinting against his skin, and wondered what stories had shaped him. The scars across his chest spoke of battles, yet his eyes, when they flickered toward her, held no cruelty. She began to wonder if his silence was not emptiness but choice, a barrier against a world eager to misunderstand him. Meanwhile, the town of Coldwater was anything but silent. Word of the auction spread faster than the storm winds. Martha Calloway was the first to pour venom, whispering to wives at the mercantile. "She'll be wearing feathers by spring," she spat. "If she's not dead of shame before then." Laughter followed, thin and brittle, but fear stirred beneath it. Some muttered that Dakota's purchase was theft, a challenge to law and order. Others whispered darker things, that no white woman should share a cabin with an Apache and still call herself Christian. Gossip grew like frost across every pane, sharper each day. Sheriff Alden Graves carried the rumors with the weight of law. He drank them in at the saloon, where firelight glowed on whiskey glasses and men's tempers warmed too easily. "He bought her for $1, Graves said, voice low, eyes hard. "That ain't a marriage. That's a theft. A theft of one of ours." He let the words hang, inviting anger to feed on them. Men who once sneered at Chenoa as worthless now growled about her, as if she were their kin, their pride stung by Dakota's audacity. They spoke of riding out, of reminding the Apache where his boundaries lay. The storm kept them for now, but storms pass. Back at the cabin, Chenoa felt the shift in the air though no words reached her. She saw it in Dakota's watchfulness, how his eyes flicked to the horizon when the wind stilled, how he lingered by the door at night as though listening for footsteps beneath the gale. She did not ask. She had no right to ask. Yet part of her longed to know if danger loomed, if the fragile shelter they had found was already cracking beneath outside weight. One evening, while Dakota mended a harness by the fire, she found courage to speak. Her voice wavered, but she forced the question. Why did you bid for me?" The silence stretched long, broken only by the snap of firewood. At last, his dark eyes lifted, steady as ever. "You were alone," he said simply, the words heavy with more than they told. She searched his face for jest, for cruelty, for desire, but found none. His gaze returned to the harness, and the moment closed like a door, leaving her with more questions than answers. Kiona watched her closely after that, as though weighing her spirit. One morning, when Dakota had gone to gather wood, the elder spoke softly. "My son has known loss. Many winters have carved him. He does not bind with chains. He waits for what endures." Chenoa pressed her shawl tighter, trembling. She did not know if she was strong enough to endure, or if her worth had been too worn away by shame to survive such patience. The storm broke at last, leaving the sky sharp and clear. Tracks reappeared, and with them came unease. Riders from town passed near the treeline, their voices loud, their laughter brittle. Chenoa shrank from the window, her heart racing. She heard snatches, Martha's shrill tone, men cursing Dakota's name, threats wrapped in jest. The sound of it chilled her more than the cold ever had. For the first time since the auction, she wished desperately for the crowd's indifference again, rather than their sharpened eyes. That night, she lay awake long after the fire dimmed. Outside, the forest creaked with settling frost. Dakota sat near the door, sharpening a blade, the scrape rhythmic, steady. Each stroke was both comfort and warning. Chenoa closed her eyes, but she could not still her heart. She knew then that the storm within the town was only beginning, and its path would lead straight to the cabin, where silence no longer promised safety. When dawn crept pale over the snow, a crow circled overhead, its cry cutting through the stillness. Dakota looked up sharply, his jaw set. He turned to Chenoa, his voice low but certain, the first time he had spoken to her with command. "They will come." The storm that had muffled the world for days broke into a brittle stillness, the kind that sharpened sound and made every creak of branch echo. Chenoa felt it in her bones before she saw them. The town had not forgotten her, nor the man who had claimed her for a single coin. That morning, Dakota stood outside the cabin, bare chest rising like a mountain against the pale sky, splitting wood with strokes so measured they seemed carved into the rhythm of the earth itself. She sat at the window, her hands clasped tight in her shawl, her breath fogging the glass. The silence carried a weight that was not peace but waiting. Elder Kiona dozed near the fire, though his ears, Chenoa knew, missed nothing. By mid-afternoon, the first riders appeared at the edge of the trees. Dark figures against the snow, their voices carried harsh and eager. Sheriff Alden Graves rode at their head, rifle resting easy in his hand, his jaw set like a man convinced of his own righteousness. Behind him clustered townsmen with faces flushed from drink and pride, their eyes bright with something less than courage. Chenoa's heart jolted, her breath catching. For a moment she thought she might vanish if she pressed herself flat against the wall. But Dakota had already straightened, the axe steady at his side, his gaze fixed on the intruders with the same stillness he gave the storm. The men reined in at the clearing, their horses snorting clouds into the brittle air. "Dakota!" Graves' voice cracked across the snow. "You've taken what ain't yours. That girl belongs with her own. You'll send her out now, and we'll walk away." His words rang with authority, but behind them Chenoa heard the poison of gossip, the echoes of Martha Calloway's whispers dressed in the sheriff's badge. Dakota did not move. He leaned the axe against the cabin wall and stepped forward, the snow crunching slow beneath his bare feet. His silence made the men shift uneasily, for words could be twisted, but silence was a mirror, forcing them to hear their own noise. Chenoa trembled inside, watching through the window, torn between terror and a rising anger she did not yet understand. She saw the way the men's eyes flicked to her shadow behind the glass, as though she were a prize to be reclaimed, not a soul with a voice. Graves barked again. "You think you can steal a white woman, flaunt her like some trophy? Law won't have it. Send her out, or we'll come in." The butt of his rifle tapped against his saddle, a threat heavy with promise. The others muttered, gripping reins, shifting weight, eager for violence yet wary of the man before them. At that moment, Elder Kiona stepped into the doorway. His fur cloak draped heavy, his white hair gleaming against the storm-dark sky. He raised a hand, palm outward, the gesture neither surrender nor threat, but recognition of what they already were, men too frightened of silence to face it. His voice cracked like old wood but carried steady. The snow does not ask who is white, who is Apache. It covers all. Why do you stand here, stirring the wind with hatred? The sheriff spat into the snow. Save your stories. We're here for the girl. His eyes cut toward the cabin window. If she don't come now, we'll drag her. The words sliced through Chenoa. Shame and fury burned her throat. She remembered the auction block, the laughter when Boone mocked her fate. She remembered the whispers in the street, the latches slammed in her face. And she saw herself reflected in the glass, pale, trembling, shawl clutched like a shroud. If she stayed inside, she would always be what they named her. A burden, a spoil, a thing passed from hand to hand. Her legs moved before fear could stop them. She flung the door wide, the blast of cold air biting her lungs, the snow stinging her cheeks. Shawl slipping, she stepped into the clearing, each footstep sinking deep. The men gasped, surprise cutting their jeers. Dakota turned, his dark eyes steady on her, not commanding her forward, not holding her back. Only watching, as though waiting to see who she chose to be. Her voice cracked, but it carried. You call me stolen, but you never wanted me whole. You sold me for scraps, mocked me for shame. She drew breath, the words trembling from a place deeper than fear. He gave $1, but he gave me dignity. And I will not return to your cruelty. The clearing fell silent, but for the hiss of wind. Martha Calloway's shrill protest rose faintly from among the riders, yet it faltered in the hush that followed. The men glanced at one another, unease shifting in their saddles. Graves' face flushed red with fury, but even his hand on the rifle faltered at the sight of her standing beside Dakota, her head high, her voice unbroken. Dakota moved then, only a step, until he stood beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence filled the space like a wall no bullet could breach. Together they faced the line of riders, snow swirling between them, a quiet defiance more powerful than any shouted threat. Graves swore, the sound bitter, then jerked his reins. This ain't over, he spat. Coldwater won't stand for it. The men followed, their anger loud but their retreat louder. Hooves thundered away into the trees, leaving the clearing swallowed by snow once more. Chenoa's knees trembled, her breath shallow. She had never felt smaller, yet never so unshackled. She turned to Dakota, her lips parting, unsure what to say. But his gaze met hers, steady, unflinching, and she saw in it the reflection of what she had just claimed. A life not dictated by gossip, nor by fear, but by her own voice. Back inside, the fire crackled, but the silence was no longer the same. It pulsed with something new, something fragile. Kiona's eyes glimmered with quiet pride, though he said nothing. Chenoa sat, her hands trembling in her lap, replaying the moment when her voice cut through their laughter like a blade. She had stood, she had spoken, and though the storm was not ended, a path had opened through it. That night, as the cabin settled into shadow, she lay awake listening to the wind. Each creak of the timbers reminded her that danger was not gone. Graves would not forget, nor would the town. But for the first time, she was not merely enduring. She had chosen. And as she closed her eyes, she felt the weight of that choice settle deep into her chest, heavier than fear, steadier than silence. In the morning, the snow would show new tracks. Whether friend or foe, she could not know. But she knew this. She would no longer hide behind walls or windows. Whatever came, she would stand beside him. Dawn broke pale over the cabin, its light scattering like shards of glass across the snowdrifts. Chenoa rose from her corner with a heart still thrumming from the night before. The sheriff's threats clung to her ears, but so too did the memory of her own voice, rising steady in the clearing. She had spoken, and no one could take those words back. Yet strength earned one night can falter in the morning, and fear crept in with the chill. She wrapped her shawl tight, stepping closer to the hearth where Elder Kiona sipped from a steaming cup, his eyes watching her without demand, only quiet acknowledgement that something inside her had shifted. Outside, Dakota split logs with strokes precise as ritual. Each crack echoed through the valley, steady, unhurried, the rhythm of a man preparing for storm. Chenoa studied him through the frost-blurred window. He bore himself with the certainty of stone, yet she wondered if even stone could withstand the force of a town bent on breaking what it feared. She pressed her palm to the glass as if she could touch his strength, borrow it, let it seep into the marrow of her bones. By noon the sky had dimmed, clouds rolling heavy and dark. A blizzard gathered, wind already keening through the trees like mourning women. Chenoa helped stack wood near the hearth, her fingers raw, her shoulders aching, but she refused to stop. Takota carried in armfuls of kindling, his silence the same as always, though she caught him watching her as she worked. He said nothing, yet when the last of the wood was set inside, he brushed snow from his shoulders and placed a white feather upon the table. Its down caught the firelight, glowing as though lit from within. Chenoa froze, her breath caught. Slowly, she reached for it, her hands trembling. She lifted it to her chest, her eyes stinging with tears. Takota did not speak. He only met her gaze, the stillness in his eyes holding more vow than any words could offer. She clutched the feather, understanding without needing to be told. This was no command. It was invitation. Before the moment could settle, the storm struck with a roar. Wind slammed against the walls, snow hurled itself sideways, rattling shutters, seeping through the cracks. The cabin groaned like an old ship at sea. Kiona stirred, his face calm but grave. "The storm will test the beams," he said softly. Takota was already moving, bracing timbers, pressing his great weight against the door as the wind clawed to tear it free. Chenoa's fear surged hot, but instead of shrinking back, she sprang to his side, her shawl flaring, her hands pressed against the beam with his. He glanced at her, the faintest flicker of surprise in his dark eyes, before his jaw set, and he leaned harder. Together they held, the gale shrieking around them. Snow sifted through the seams, icy fingers burning her skin, yet she did not falter. Her body shook, her breath came ragged, but she bore the weight beside him, and in that crucible something in her shame broke like brittle glass. Hours passed in a blur of struggle. They shored the roof with spare planks, piled snow against the outer walls to keep the wind from prying them open. Chenoa's hands bled from splinters, her back screamed, but each time weakness threatened she caught Takota's gaze and found herself steadied. He worked with tireless resolve, not shielding her from the storm but enduring it with her, as though teaching her that dignity lived not in being spared, but in standing unbroken. At last, the storm eased its fury. Wind softened to a weary moan, snow fell gentler, like ash after fire. The cabin still stood, scarred but upright. Inside, silence returned, heavy with exhaustion but alive. Chenoa collapsed onto the furs, breathless, her palms raw, her chest aching. Takota knelt across from her, his own body heaving, his scars glistening with sweat despite the cold. Their eyes met in the fire's glow, and for the first time, she did not look away. She saw the weight he carried, the loneliness carved deep, and something within her reached past fear. She had chosen to stand, and now she chose to remain. The days that followed carried whispers of the town's anger. Riders glimpsed at the ridge, shadows moving in the distance. But the storm had changed her. Where once she would have trembled, now she moved with a quiet pride. She began to stitch fabric into a dress, plain but white, the only cloth she could find, a symbol drawn not from command but from her own will. When she tried it on, standing before the fire with her hair loose about her shoulders, she felt the weight of shame fall away. She was no longer the widow shivering on the auction block. She was a woman who had endured, who had chosen, who now claimed her place. Takota entered then, carrying water from the well, his arms glistening with cold. He stopped, his gaze resting on her. He did not smile, did not speak, but his silence burned brighter than any words. She stepped toward him, the feathers still tucked into her dress, her head lifted. He lowered the bucket slowly, his hand brushing hers as if to seal a vow. Elder Kiona watched from his seat by the hearth, his lips curving with the faintest smile. "The snow has melted where it was meant to," he said softly. That night, Chenoa and Takota stood at the cabin door, the world hushed in silver. The town would not forget nor forgive, but their whispers no longer bound her. She had walked beside him through storm and judgment, and she would walk beside him still. The white of her dress glowed against the dark, the feather at her breast catching the moonlight. She felt his presence beside her, vast and steady, and she knew her answer to the question Boone had spat with cruel laughter. She would wear white, not as property, but as choice. Forever was no jest, it was a vow forged in storm. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of a world that had tried to break her. She drew closer to him, her hand finding his, and for the first time he closed his fingers around hers, not to claim, but to affirm. The storm had not ended the danger, but it had carved them into something that would endure. And in that hush of snow and firelight, Chenoa felt dignity root deep, unshakable, as she stepped into the life that had waited all along.